Hello and welcome to this video. Amongst the many news items we have for you this week is the interesting debacle around the Cleveland Clinic paper that has been widely misinterpreted. The claim that womb transplants may soon be available for transgender individuals. A somewhat political situation with the University of Pennsylvania and their efforts to revoke tenure from a controversial professor. Issues to do with controversy about the FDA and both their advice to make naloxone an over-the-counter medication and the approvals process involved in that. Finally, the retraction of many papers. These and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the vaccine study that has everybody worried that if they get the booster, they're at more risk of being infected by COVID-19. Short answer, no. You don't need to worry about an increased risk of infection. It is the exact opposite. You have a lower risk of infection after the booster. Much of this stems from the fact that the article went into preprint last year. Preprint is basically where a manuscript has been accepted, it hasn't been polished and there's still some reviewing issues, but it's at least otherwise generally accepted to be solid enough research to go out there for people to begin looking at it. It was an especially popular process in the early days of COVID, where getting information as early as possible and as extensively as possible was really important to get a strong idea about what is happening. It has, however, continued, and the practice isn't exactly ideal. Because again, there are still teething issues with these articles. Sometimes reviewers will have problems with some of the methodologies, some of the statements made, and similar. And so, as a result, you often find preprint articles tend to be less reliable, let's say. And so, when it was available as a preprint, people were looking into it, and obviously, without having had that necessary layer of polish, it didn't come across the way it was meant to. One of the hypothesized reasons as to why this has happened is, as we've mentioned, the fact that a lot of the information may not have been communicated as effectively for lay people, particularly the fact that there were two different tables. The first table spoke about the relative risk of getting infected, and the second about vaccination status. People assumed that the two tables were related, but remember, they are two separate figures. This means that what is in Table 1 does not show up in Table 2 and vice versa. And that is the key here. Table 1 looked at the bivalent booster and the effects there. Table 2 specifically looked at the relationship between various factors and the hospitalization rates. Understand that this is not necessarily the bivalent vaccine or the original vaccine. And that's the key here. A misunderstanding has led to a lot of controversy around a study that, once you understand how it's read, is very different. This is very similar to the article from the National Post that writes about the possibility of womb transplants for transgender women. This is a interesting idea for a number of reasons. The most obvious is that biologically, a male becoming a female will not have the capacity for reproduction, and this is simply a reality. They do not have a functioning uterus. They can have other parts of the female anatomy, whether they are surgically provided or otherwise, but the actual ability to reproduce isn't there. Conversely, a female to male could, in theory, so long as the internal genitalia was not removed. Then they would be able to carry a child, but they would have to stop hormones during that time. This is where the Cleveland Clinic, yet again, finds itself in the news, and the idea of taking a uterus from a deceased donor and transplanting it into a woman who did not have one. Now, that by itself isn't very controversial. It's the idea that if you can do that for a woman who was having uterine problems, why not do it for a transgender woman? There were a number of ethical questions then raised after this, such as, what if the embryo that was carried was conceived using the frozen sperm of the individual who then received the transplant? Who exactly is the mother, the father? Are they a clone? how exactly do you treat these individuals? But those ethical and philosophical questions aside, there are far more immediate issues, and the most practical is going to be the genetics and the issues around transplants themselves. If you transplant tissue, you need to be very careful and get as close a match as you possibly can, or it will be rejected. This means that despite the over 80 uterine transplants that have occurred in 10 countries since 2014, only 35 babies have been delivered this way. It's a very complicated process, and it now involves the intersection of all kinds of different kinds of medicine, whether that is immunology, surgery, reproductive health, and more. The last obvious practical issue with this is going to be the delivery of the child. There is an anatomical difference in the hip structure between males and females. As a result, any male who receives a donor uterus will need to deliver the child via caesarean section. You simply cannot pass a child through the pelvic floor of a male. It is too narrow and it will end badly for everybody, and possibly fatally. There is a final interesting note in the article, and it specifically talks about the way that biological females who receive uterine transplants normally have the uterus removed after 2 children so that they can be taken off graft rejection drugs. And because of this, there are questions about not only the safety, but the actual benefits of a male receiving a uterus this way. And so it's become a very, very messy situation for ethical, moral, and philosophical reasons. We'll leave the decision as to which of these is what they are and how they are to you. In a similar quandary, you'll find the University of Pennsylvania. They're trying to revoke tenure from one of its most controversial lecturers, specifically Amy Wax. She is a professor of law, and, unsurprisingly, given her age, she has tenure. Tenure basically says that you will stay at this university until you die or you quit of your own accord. We cannot fire you without you doing something very bad. You may wonder what this professor said that was so controversial that students are demanding they be fired. Well, it boils down to immigration, which shouldn't surprise anybody. In short, she believes that America should focus on allowing people to immigrate from countries with similar values to America's. She apparently said that those nations remain mostly white for now. This is what seems to have kicked off the entire debacle. The words she said are being put forward as racist and having caused actual harm. The big challenge the university faces in this case is twofold. One is the academic freedom. That is, an academic has the freedom to say something that may be construed as irrevocably offensive or incredibly offensive, but that is not cause to fire them or penalize them, because it is given in their capacity as an academic, and the speech she gave was such a scenario. The other issue is the direct freedom of speech argument, and that is that there should be open and honest discussion in universities where if somebody disagrees with something, it should be debated. Both of these come back from the very early 20th century issues to do with universities. Basically, there was an ongoing problem where people were being fired for espouting what would now be considered very well-grounded theories, like evolution. Unfortunately, at that time, 100 years ago, it wasn't so well received. The solution to this was tenure. You gave somebody a degree of security in their job, and as a result, they were able to push the envelope that little bit more and provide a much wider, much more comprehensive, and much more stimulating environment for the students. This case does differ from others where this is a purely theory-based argument. That is, what she put forward in speech is being viewed as something that she may be sacked for, and this has academics worried, in terms of do they actually have freedom of speech and academic freedoms to be able to teach and administer their courses as they see fit, or will they be beholden to their students? To give some context to how serious the process they've initiated is, The last time the University of Pennsylvania used this process to remove a tenured professor, it was due to murdering their spouse. And most reasonable people would say that words are not equivocable to murder unless you are directly inciting murder. And that's not the case. The University of Pennsylvania does find itself in other controversy as well attached to this, and that's all around the investigations they've conducted. And let's be clear here, investigations as in more than one, because they were not happy with the results of the first. Yeah, they actually ran a second investigation to try and find something to punish her for. The evidence found in the first investigation is that everything they're trying to basically try her in a kangaroo court for now was not evidenced. Yeah, and they haven't given this information to Wax either. So the professor was kept in the dark for what was happening. While a very controversial figure, Professor Wax is not, as so far evidenced, somebody who has broken the university's rules. Despite this, the university has gone on to make a series of further efforts that are described in the article, to which you'll find a link in the description box below. Next we go on to something far less serious and boring. Earthing, or more accurately, the pseudo-scientific practice of earthing. This is also known as grounding, and that should immediately give you an idea as to what's going to happen. The gist of this is that you walk barefoot on the ground, and that by doing that, you ground yourself, or allow your body's electrical charge to dissipate. This is used in electrical things all the time. The idea is, for example, with your house, apartment, or similar. If there's an excess electricity, it will take the easiest route to where it wants to go, and that can mean dissipating into the ground. This is great to prevent your house from burning down. It doesn't really work for human bodies though. The issue is very basic with this. Assuming that for whatever reason, it was plausible that by walking on the ground, you could either dissipate or absorb electrons, thereby removing or adding charge to your body to balance yourself out for your health, how does the system know how to be balanced? Electricity will flow wherever it can most easily, and the human body is, fundamentally, just a sack of water surrounded by protein. It is very amicable to electrons, and they will flow right into it. This is why if you get struck by lightning, you don't just get a nice little jolt, you die, or you get seriously injured. This is why grounding is, at best, a ridiculous idea, but when you look at it biologically, it's not possible either. The body, as already mentioned, is made up of proteins. Proteins rely on a particular balance in the charge of its environment. Once you start shifting that charge, you get a massive change in the way the proteins will behave. They will denature and lose their structure. When this happens, cell walls and similar all begin to break down and no longer serve their purpose. This leads to destruction of the body. This is a biological reason why grounding doesn't make any sense. But the article from Science-Based Medicine goes through 4 ways in which it's very clear that grounding does not work and that the entire notion is at best dubious, if not outright wrong. The 4 features they give are methodological rigor, significantly positive effects, reasonable clinical effect, and replication. Having 3 or fewer of these is not enough, because you can basically cherry pick data to get those to happen. Whereas if you run your experiment, find results, and somebody runs the same experiment and can't, there's likely a methodological issue with one or the other of the experiments. And so, if you go through their article, you'll see grounding really is a fool's errand. Less of a fool's errand is that the FDA has advised that naloxone should be an over-the-counter medication. Naloxone is used for opioid overdoses, and in America, opioid overdoses are a major concern at the minute. The advantages of this medication over others is that it is a nasal spray. It can very quickly, very easily, and very effectively reverse overdoses. The benefit of it is that since it's a nasal spray delivery, it's very easy to administer. This means that if you have someone you're worried about having an overdose, if you're a medic or similar, you can deal with it, and you can save lives very quickly. With the FDA making the decision that it has several benefits. The first is that it's going to be much more widely available. This is going to help, at least in theory, with the very large number of opioid overdoses. The second is that it should bring the price down. Not only do you have the physician price to get the prescription, but you then need to get the prescription filled. And this eventually leads to the issue of multiple costs all stacking up to make it inaccessible. By having it as an over-the-counter medication, theoretically, a 2-dose pack could cost up to $65 and most likely less. The challenge, once this has been put through to the actual practice stage, will be to see how realistic the idea that naloxone or narcan, as it may better be known to you, is user-friendly. One of the frequent errors that was observed in studies of how easy it is to use is that people would spray it into the air rather than into someone's nose. There were also issues of people waiting too long to try and administer the dose. Despite these barriers, it was approved for over-the-counter administration and sale, primarily because it has a very good safety profile, meaning there is very little risk relative to not having it available. On the other side of the aisle, so to speak, the FDA has been quite harshly criticized for the Aduhelm drug that it approved. This is an Alzheimer's drug, and there are some big worries about what's going on here. The government investigation into what the FDA did, along with Biogen, found a number of issues. This included atypical behavior that was not following the protocols of the FDA. That raises some pretty big red flags already. There was the unexpected and unusual change from the traditional pathway, which is much longer, to the accelerated pathway, and this meant that they could get to market much sooner. The fact that the FDA could not justify this or explain why they did that is yet another big red flag. There was also the history of the company, specifically making history. The idea was that it would be the first drug that they had available for Alzheimer's. The idea is that it would help to bolster them in the public image and make them a lot of money. Then there was the actual expense of money, and notably the marketing campaign that Biogen funded. They were going to spend more than $3 billion on marketing and sales between 2020 and 2024. That's more than they spent on other drugs that they were developing from 2007 to 2021, or 14 years worth of funding. Well, more than 14 years at that. And so, obvious questions were raised about how they were going to recoup their costs, so to speak, given that they just spent a very large amount of money, even for Big Pharma. This last point is especially noteworthy given that the revenue generated from this drug for all of 2021 was just $3 million. It's been refused in places like Europe, and so the questions about why and how the FDA approved it, and the fact that other regulatory bodies have not, along with all the other flags we've mentioned, and then some that are found in the article linked below, have created big problems. The final big problem for someone this week is the retraction of 24 papers. Yes, this is not the worst we've seen this week, with someone having far more papers retracted, but this particular researcher struck us because their area of specialty was autism. The fact is, autism is a difficult area to conduct research into. The big and first obvious problem is that much of the research involves children, and research involving children is very much regulated, sometimes to an excessive degree, but in this instance we do believe that caution is the better part of valor. This eventually led to the retraction of many papers. It included reasons like conflicts of interest, being the editor-in-chief of the journal where the papers were published, and the independent peer review not being independent or reviewed. These are not new issues to come to light. In fact, these issues were raised to the journals in question 8 years ago, and that is how long it has taken for this action to be taken. Mostly because the investigation by the journals was a very slow and tedious process, as it nearly always is when it comes to a retraction. The big problem for this guy is not going to be so much the retractions, as they can happen, and with somebody as, let's say, well established in the field as he is, they aren't going to hurt him as much as they would a much more junior researcher. Rather, it's the papers in particular that were retracted that are going to hurt him. Many of them included diagnostic measures that he had developed. These are methodologies that would be cited in other research. And so, if your methods aren't being cited, you aren't being cited. And that's going to take an axe to the ankles of his entire research career. It's going to tip it over from the base up. The reason for this is simple. The more you are cited, the more influential you are, the more you get cited, the more you get seen, the more you get cited, the more prestigious your position is. Because methodology is one of the areas where most researchers will get cited very frequently if their research and method is robust, losing that is a big blow. He will now have to rely on original research using either other researchers' methodologies or build up new methodologies that will be taken with a lot more skepticism now. The article goes into a lot more detail on just what happened and the rather cutthroat area that is research when it comes to publishing and the various interactions within publishing, and you'll find that there's a lot of information here that can be, let's say, rather soap opera-like. It would be worthwhile reading the full depth of information in there, as it also explains what happened, how it was resolved, and other issues with this particular researcher who, although now retired, does have a lasting impact on the field as a result. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.